My name is Anna Miller. I'm 29 years old, and I live in Seattle, a city where the rain seems endless, yet somehow it feels alive and comforting. If you met me today, you'd probably think I have a stable, peaceful life. I work in finance, I rent a cozy apartment downtown, and on the surface everything looks fine. But behind that calm facade lies a story I never imagined I would have to tell, a story about family love, betrayal, and the kind of secrets that quietly rot the foundation of a life you thought was unshakable. I grew up in a small suburban house just outside of Seattle. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple single-story home with white paint that had started to fade over the years, and a small backyard where my mom grew chrysanthemums and a few rows of vegetables. But to me as a child, it was everything. That house always smelled like fresh bread or cookies, and it always felt safe. My mom, Linda, was the center of my world. She was a sweet, soft-spoken elementary school teacher. My biological father left when I was just 4. I barely remember his face. The only thing I do remember are the nights my mom would rock me to sleep while quietly crying, thinking I couldn't hear her. A few years later, she met Mark, a carpenter, who worked for a small construction company. He wasn't rich. He wasn't the romantic, charming type you see in movies. But Mom told me Mark was a good man, reliable, and most importantly, he loved us. I believed her. Mark never tried to replace my father, but he treated me kindly. On some afternoons, he'd show me how to hammer nails into a piece of scrap wood, or how to build a tiny wooden chair for my dolls. I still remember the smell of sawdust clinging to his clothes, a smell that somehow felt warm and safe. Back then, we didn't have much money. Mom's teaching salary covered the basics, but didn't leave any room for luxuries. Mark's income depended on seasonal work, so there were months that were harder than others. But I never once felt like we were poor. Mom always told me happiness didn't come from big houses or expensive things, it came from love and trust. I remember one rainy evening, I asked her why we didn't have a bigger house like some of my classmates. She smiled, gently, brushed a strand of hair from my face, and said, "Anna, family is the one thing that will never betray you. No matter how hard life gets, I'll always be here for you." Those words stayed with me. I carried them with me through every milestone in my life. I believed them so deeply that I never questioned them. Mom was there for everything that mattered. She taught me how to cook my first meal, how to save my allowance, how to treat people with kindness. She never missed a single birthday. She was there at every school event, always in the front row, clapping the loudest. In every old photo, you can see her standing right beside me, pride shining in her eyes. And every time life felt heavy, she would hug me tightly and whisper, "No matter what happens, I'll always be here for you." I grew up with the unshakable belief that a mother's love was forever, that no matter how the world changed, she would always be my anchor. Even when I went off to college and eventually stayed in Seattle for work, I called her almost every day. I drove home on weekends whenever I could. I never doubted for a second that our bond would remain strong for the rest of our lives. But 2 years ago, something began to shift. At first it was subtle. I noticed it during one winter visit. The house didn't look the same. The roof had a few leaks, the paint was peeling more than I remembered, and the backyard garden was overgrown. Inside, I saw envelopes scattered on the kitchen table. Utility bills, some unopened letters with bold red stamps that looked like overdue notices. Mom quickly gathered them and smiled as if nothing was wrong. "Just a few things I need to sort out. Don't worry about it," she said lightly. Mark was acting strange too. He seemed busier than usual, always out running errands or meeting with someone about a new project. When I asked, Mom brushed it off. "Mark is thinking about starting his own woodworking shop. It's a lot of work, but it's a good thing," she told me. She said it with a smile, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, anxiety maybe, or fear. I didn't push. I trusted her. I thought maybe they were just going through a rough patch financially. I kept sending her a bit of money every month to help out. It wasn't much, but it made me feel like I was supporting her the way she always supported me. But the distance between us slowly grew. Phone calls became shorter. She stopped inviting me home as often. Whenever I suggested visiting, there was always some excuse: she was busy with school. Mark wasn't feeling well, the house was a mess. I told myself it was just temporary. but deep down, I felt something was wrong. Then one day, everything cracked open. I received a letter in the mail. It wasn't for me, it was addressed to Linda and Mark, but it had been sent to my apartment in Seattle by mistake. I stared at the envelope for a long time before finally opening it. It was from the bank. A past due notice for a $200,000 loan. 3 months overdue. Immediate action required to avoid foreclosure. I froze. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely think. My mother and Mark had never mentioned anything about a loan, especially not something this big. I grabbed my phone and called her immediately. She answered after a few rings, her voice calm but strangely flat. "Mom, what is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You and Mark? You're behind on a loan. $200,000. Why didn't you tell me?" There was a long silence. For a moment I thought the call had dropped. Then she finally spoke, her voice clipped cold. "Anna, don't get involved in things you don't understand. This is between me and Mark. We'll handle it." I tried to press her for answers, but she ended the call. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my apartment. My mind was racing. What was going on? Why would she hide something like this from me? Was Mark in trouble? Was the woodworking shop even real? All the warm memories of my childhood clashed with this new uneasy feeling in my gut. Something was deeply wrong. I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I had to know the truth. So I made a decision. That weekend I would drive back to the house, the same house that once felt like the safest place in the world. What I didn't know then was that going back would unravel everything. It would lead me to secrets I never imagined my mother was capable of keeping. And it would be the day I learned that even the people you trust the most can betray you in ways you never see coming. When I first started working full-time, I made it a habit to send my mom a little extra money each month. It wasn't much, just enough for her to buy something nice for herself or cover a bill she might have overlooked. At first, she would thank me warmly, even joke that I didn't know. But over time, something about her tone began to change. She'd still thank me, but quickly shift the conversation to something else. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, like a door slowly closing wit. I began to notice that whenever I asked how she and Mark were doing financially, "Everything's fine, Anna," she would say always too quickly. "We're just simplifying life, you know. Living with less clutter feels good." Her words were light, but there was something in her voice I brushed it off the first few times. After all, they'd always been independent, proud of standing on their own feet. But the unease inside me kept growing like a faint echo that wouldn't go away. The next time I visited, the signs were harder to ignore. The house I grew up in looked different. The gutters were sagging, overflowing with wet leaves. The garden that used to bloom with chrysanthemums was dry, overrun with weeds. Inside, the walls felt colder, somehow more hollow. I went into the kitchen to help Mom with dinner and saw a pile of envelopes on the counter. Most were unopened, but one caught my eye. Final notice stamped in bold red letters. I instinctively reached for it, but Mom snatched it up with surprising speed. "Just an old bill." "Nothing urgent," she said, stuffing it into a drawer. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. That night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over. Mom had always been open about everything. Why was she hiding things now? The following morning, as I was packing to leave, I overheard a snippet of conversation between Mom and Mark. I was in the hallway when their voices drifted from the living room. "We need more time," Mom whispered. "The payment's coming up again. I told you I'm working on it." Mark said, his tone edged with frustration. "Once the shop's up and running, we'll be fine." I froze. Payment shop. When I stepped into the room, their voices stopped immediately. Mark forced a tight smile. "Heading back to Seattle already?" he asked almost too casually. I nodded, but the air felt heavy. Something was off. After that trip, I started hearing things I wasn't supposed to hear. One of Mom's neighbors, Mrs. Allen, called me out of the blue. She's known me since I was a kid, and she sounded hesitant at first, like she wasn't sure if she should even say anything. "Anna, I don't mean to pry," she began gently, "but I've noticed some men coming by your mother's house recently. From the bank, I think. And I heard Mark took out a loan for a new woodworking shop, but she trailed off. But what I pressed. But no one's seen the shop. And, well, people are saying he might have gotten in over his head. I thanked her, trying to keep my voice calm, but my hands were shaking. That evening I called Mom. "Hey, I heard Mark's starting a new shop." "That's exciting." I tried to sound casual. There was a pause. "It's just an idea," she said finally. "Nothing certain yet. Don't worry yourself with it." She changed the subject so fast it was like hitting a wall. It wasn't just the financial questions she avoided. It was everything. She stopped telling me little things about her day. She no longer mentioned her students at school or the funny things Mark did. Our conversations became shorter, emptier. One night, after another brief and awkward phone call, I sat on my couch in Seattle, staring at the phone in my hand. My mother, the woman who raised me alone, who taught me to always tell the truth, was lying to me. I could feel it in my bones. But why I tried to piece things together logically. Maybe the loan really was for a new business. Maybe they were just going through a temporary rough patch. Maybe Mom didn't want me to worry because she knew I'd try to help. But if it was just that, why the secrecy weeks passed and the strange signs multiplied? I sent her a small check for her birthday. She thanked me but insisted she didn't cash it. A few days later, I got an automated alert from my bank confirming the deposit. She had cashed it. A friend of mine from the old neighborhood told me the house looked neglected, like no one had the time or energy to take care of it anymore. And then there were the phone calls I accidentally overheard when Mom thought I wasn't on the line yet. Her voice was sharp, desperate, so unlike the calm, steady woman I grew up with. "No, we just need a little longer. Please don't do anything yet," I heard her whisper once before she realized I was on the other end. When I asked who she was talking to, she laughed nervously and said it was a telemarketer. I knew she was lying. Each piece of the puzzle only made the picture blurrier. I was stuck in this space between suspicion and denial. I didn't want to think the worst of her. She was my mother. She'd always been the strongest person I knew. But the more I looked, the more cracks I saw. One afternoon, while I was on a lunch break at work, I decided to call the local business registry on a whim. I wanted to see if Mark's supposed woodworking shop was actually registered. The woman on the phone told me politely that no such business existed under his name. I remember hanging up the phone, staring blankly at my computer screen, feeling like the floor beneath me had just shifted. If the shop didn't exist, where did all the money go? I called Mom again that night, my voice firm. "Mom, are you sure everything is okay? Is there something you're not telling me?" Her reply was cold, almost defensive. "Anna, you're overthinking this. We're fine. Please stop digging into things that don't concern you." That was the moment I realized I couldn't trust her words anymore. I started to have trouble sleeping. At night, memories of my childhood would replay Mom's laughter, her warmth, the way she always made me feel safe. But now, those same memories felt fragile, like they belonged to someone else's life. I kept thinking about what Mrs. Allen said, about the unopened bills, about the mysterious men coming by the house. Everything pointed to one conclusion: Mom and Mark were in some kind of trouble, big trouble, and they were hiding it from me. The hardest part was the loneliness that crept in with that realization. The woman who had always been my safe place was now a stranger with secrets I couldn't reach. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I needed answers. I needed the truth, even if it hurt. So I made a plan. The next weekend I would drive back to that house, the one that used to feel like home, and confront her. Whatever she was hiding, I was going to find out. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I had just come home from work, exhausted from a string of back-to-back meetings. I checked my mailbox on the way into my apartment, expecting the usual: a couple of bills, some promotional flyers, maybe a letter from a friend. But among the envelopes, there was one that froze me in place. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Linda Miller and Mark Miller, my mom and stepdad. I turned it over in my hands. The return address was from a bank. My first instinct was confusion. Why would a bank send mail for them to my address? I assumed it was some clerical error. Maybe they'd updated their contact details and the system got mixed up. But as I climbed the stairs to my apartment, something gnawed at me. There was a weight to that envelope, an unspoken tension that I could almost feel. I stood in my kitchen, holding it for what felt like forever. Part of me knew I shouldn't open it. It wasn't meant for me. But another part of me, the part that had been restless for weeks, that had been sensing something wrong, couldn't ignore it. Finally, with shaky hands, I tore it open. The words blurred for a moment as I scanned them. Then they came into sharp, terrifying focus. Past due notice. $200,000 loan. 3 months in arrears. Immediate payment required to avoid foreclosure and legal action. My breath caught in my throat. $200,000. I read the letter again, hoping I'd misunderstood. But there it was in black and white. My mom and Mark had taken out an enormous loan, and they were months behind on payments. I sank into a chair, my knees weak. My mind went blank for a moment before panic set in. Why didn't she tell me? What is this money for? How bad could it be if the bank is threatening foreclosure? I grabbed my phone with trembling fingers and called her immediately. She answered on the second ring, her voice as calm as ever. "Hi, sweetheart. How was your day?" I didn't even answer. "Mom," I said, my voice shaking. "I just got a letter. From the bank. For you. It says you and Mark took out a loan. $200,000. You're 3 months behind on payments. What's going on?" There was silence. A long, heavy silence that made my stomach twist. "Mom," I repeated, my voice rising. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold, almost distant. "Anna, this isn't something you need to worry about." "What do you mean, don't worry? This is serious. Why didn't you tell me? Are you in trouble? Do you need help, Anna?" She said again, this time sharper. "Don't involve yourself in things you don't understand. It's between me and Mark. We'll handle it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was the woman who used to tell me everything, who used to trust me with even the smallest details of her life. And now she was shutting me out completely. "Mom, please," I begged, "I can help. Let me help you." But she just sighed. I said no. End of discussion. And then she hung up. I sat there in stunned silence, staring at my phone. I tried calling back, but she didn't pick up. The rest of that night was a blur. I kept pacing around my apartment, replaying the conversation over and over. My mind was racing with questions. Why would she take out such a massive loan? Was Mark behind it? Was this about the mysterious woodworking shop he supposedly wanted to open? Or was it something even worse? I barely slept. By morning, I had made up my mind. I couldn't just sit in Seattle and wait for answers she clearly wasn't going to give me. I needed to see her. I needed to look her in the eyes and find out the truth. So I packed an overnight bag, took a personal day from work, and drove the 3 hours back to my hometown. The moment I pulled up to the house, I felt a pang of sadness. It looked even worse than the last time I'd seen it. The paint was peeling in large patches. The windows were streaked with dirt. The front yard, which used to have neatly trimmed grass and blooming flowers, was now a tangled mess of weeds. I knocked on the door and waited. When Mom opened it, my heart broke a little. She looked smaller somehow, thinner. Her shoulders slumped like she was carrying a weight she couldn't put down. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her hair, once always neatly styled, was tied back carelessly. For a second, she just stared at me, like she wasn't sure if she was happy or upset to see me. Then she forced a smile. "Anna, what are you doing here? I needed to see you," I said softly. "I'm worried, Mom." She hesitated before stepping aside to let me in. Inside, the house felt hollow. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. There were fewer decorations on the shelves, like she'd started selling things off or packing them away. A stack of unopened mail sat on the coffee table. I sat down on the couch, looking at her carefully. "Mom, I know about the loan. I saw the letter. Please tell me what's going on." She turned away, busying herself with the kettle in the kitchen. "It's complicated," she said finally. "It's not as bad as it looks. $200,000 isn't not as bad as it looks. Why didn't you tell me I could have helped? She shook her head. We don't need your help, Anna. Mark has a plan. We're going to fix this. You don't need to get involved. I felt a wave of frustration and helplessness wash over me. Mom, you're exhausted. I can see it. You're losing weight. You're not sleeping. This is not fine. Whatever this is, you can't keep carrying it alone. She finally looked at me then. Really looked at me. Her eyes were glassy with unshed tears, but then just as quickly she blinked them away and put up the same wall of composure. Anna, I appreciate your concern, but this is our problem. Mark and I will handle it. You need to trust me. Trust her. The words stung because I did trust her. But how was I supposed to trust her when she was clearly drowning and refusing to reach for my hand? I reached into my bag and pulled out my checkbook. Please, let me at least help with the overdue payments, just to give you some breathing room. But she shook her head firmly. No, absolutely not. We are not taking money from you. Why? What are you so afraid of? I asked, my voice breaking. She didn't answer. Instead, she went back to the kitchen, poured tea into 2 cups, and placed one in front of me with a trembling hand. The silence between us felt like a chasm. I sat there for another hour, trying every way I could think of to get through to her. But she stayed firm. She wouldn't tell me the full story. She wouldn't let me help. When I finally left, I hugged her tightly. She hugged me back, but it felt different. Like she was holding on to a secret, even as she held on to me. I drove back to Seattle that evening with a heavy heart. I was more worried than ever, but there was still this tiny sliver of hope that maybe it really was temporary, that maybe Mark's mysterious plan would work, that maybe Mom wasn't in as much danger as it seemed. But deep down, I knew that sliver of hope was fragile. I didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. I couldn't stop thinking about my mother after that last visit. The way her hands trembled as she poured tea, the hollow emptiness in her eyes, the drawn curtains that made the house feel like it was suffocating. For days in Seattle, I couldn't focus on work. I lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself things weren't as bad as they seemed. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was very wrong, and she wasn't telling me. So I made a decision. I called the bank, asked for the overdue balance on the loan, and transferred the amount immediately. It was money I had been saving for a condo, but none of that mattered if it could stop the foreclosure notice. I told myself this would buy her time, give her room to breathe while she figured things out. Once it was done, I felt a flicker of relief. Maybe this would finally ease the pressure on her. Maybe she'd finally open up. I didn't call ahead. I wanted to tell her face to face. It was late afternoon when I pulled up to the house. It looked even more run down than before, like it had aged years in just weeks. The paint was peeling, the yard overgrown, and even from the driveway the silence inside felt heavy. I knocked, and after a long pause Mark opened the door. His face registered surprise before he masked it with a forced smile. "Anna," he said awkwardly, "we weren't expecting you." I stepped inside, my heart pounding. Mom was at the kitchen table staring blankly at a stack of papers. When she saw me, her expression flickered relief or dread. I couldn't tell. "Anna," she said flatly, "what are you doing here again?" I took a breath. "I know about the loan. I saw the letter. I paid the overdue part. You're safe for now. You have time to figure things out." I expected gratitude. Or maybe quiet tears. But what I saw instead was anger. A slow, simmering anger that darkened her eyes. "You..." What she said? Her voice sharp. "I paid the overdue balance," I repeated, confused. "It stops the foreclosure for now. You don't have to worry about losing the house immediately." Her face hardened. She pushed back from the table, standing so abruptly that the chair scraped loudly against the floor. "How dare you?" she said, her voice low but trembling with fury. I blinked, stunned. "How dare I, Mom? I'm just trying to help." "Help!" she shouted suddenly, her voice echoing off the kitchen walls. "You think you're better than me now, don't you? You think because you have some fancy job in Seattle, you can swoop in and fix everything like you're some hero. I froze, the words catching in my throat. Mom, that's not what this is. But she didn't let me finish. Her words poured out like venom. Do you know what you've done? You've humiliated me in front of Mark. You've made me look weak, like I can't handle my own life, like I'm some pathetic woman who has to rely on her daughter to clean up her mess. I turned to Mark, desperate for some reassurance, but he just stood in the doorway silent, his gaze flickering anywhere but at me. Mom, I'm not trying to humiliate you. I'm trying to protect you. You're drowning. I can see it. Protect me, she sneered, cutting me off again. I don't need your protection. I don't need your pity. I am still your mother, Anna. You don't come into my house and throw money around like you're the parent. My throat tightened. My heart felt like it was splintering. Please, I whispered. Just let me help you. Don't shut me out. But then before I could say anything more, she stepped closer and slapped me. The sound cracked through the room. My cheek burned instantly. For a moment, I couldn't even move. My mother had never ever raised a hand to me, not even once in my entire life. I stared at her, my eyes wide, unable to comprehend what just happened. I glanced at Mark, silently pleading for him to intervene, to say something, but he just shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. Mom's chest was heaving now, her face flushed with rage. Don't you dare, she spat, ever try to make me look small in this house again. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my voice. I'm not making you look small. I'm trying to stop you from falling apart. But she didn't hear me, or maybe she didn't want to. Her next words were cold and final. Get out, she said. I stared at her, my heart pounding in disbelief. What? You heard me, she said, stepping back. Get out of my house. Mom, I whispered, my voice breaking. Her face hardened into something I didn't recognize. Don't show up again. From this moment on, you are no longer my daughter. I felt my breath catch. I couldn't process the words. The woman who once rocked me to sleep, who told me she'd always stand by me, was now disowning me. You can't mean that, I said weakly. But she didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She meant every word. I turned to Mark one last time, hoping, begging for him to speak up, to tell her she was wrong. But he just lowered his eyes. And that was it. I stepped back slowly, feeling like I was moving through a nightmare. My feet carried me out of the kitchen, through the quiet living room filled with memories, and out the front door. I stood on the porch, numb, staring at the overgrown yard and cracked driveway. This was the house where I learned to walk, where she once tucked me into bed, where she whispered that no matter what happened, she would always be there for me. And now, she had thrown me away like I was nothing. I didn't know how long I stood there before I finally moved toward my car. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel, staring at the house through the windshield. I waited, half expecting her to come out and stop me, to take it all back, to tell me she didn't mean it. But the door stayed closed, so I started the engine and drove away. In the rearview mirror, the house grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely, and all I had left were her final words echoing in my head. Don't show up again. You're no longer my daughter. It was about a month after that night she disowned me. I hadn't heard a single word from her since. I tried calling, but she never picked up. My texts went unanswered. Even Mark stayed silent. The distance between us felt like an open wound that wouldn't heal. I tried to focus on my life in Seattle, but there was a constant unease gnawing at me. I knew something worse was coming. I could feel it in my gut. And then it happened. One Friday morning, I received a call from Mrs. Allen, the elderly neighbor who had always looked out for our family. Her voice was trembling. Anna, she said quietly, the bank came this morning. They're taking the house. Your mother. She's sitting on the porch with her head in her hands. I thought you should know. For a moment, I couldn't even breathe. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I left work immediately, not even bothering to explain to my manager. I just grabbed my bag, jumped into my car, and started driving. When I arrived, the sight before me didn't feel real. The house I grew up in, the place that held every memory of my childhood, was surrounded by men in suits. A moving truck was parked in the driveway. A foreclosure notice was plastered on the front door in bold, heartless letters. Mom sat on the porch, her face pale and blank, staring at nothing. I parked the car and ran to her. "Mom," I said, my voice breaking. "What's going on? What happened?" She looked up at me slowly. Her eyes were empty, hollow. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but nothing came out. One of the bank representatives came over, clipboard in hand. "Are you Anna Miller?" he asked. I nodded numbly. He explained in a cold, rehearsed tone that the mortgage was in severe default and the property was being repossessed immediately. There was no more time for negotiation. I turned back to my mother. "You didn't tell me it was this bad," I whispered. She still didn't answer. She just stared down at her hands. And then Mark arrived. He pulled into the driveway in his truck, looking pale and disheveled. He froze when he saw me there. For a second our eyes met and I saw it. Guilt. "Where have you been?" I demanded. "What is happening?" Mom finally spoke, her voice so small I almost didn't hear it. "It's gone," she said. "Everything's gone." "What do you mean, gone?" I asked. She finally raised her eyes to mine, tears welling up. "The money," she whispered. "The loan. It was never for the shop." I blinked. "What are you talking about?" Mark stepped forward. His jaw clenched, but Mom stopped him with a shaky hand. "He didn't open a woodworking shop," she said, her voice cracking. "He invested it in a project he swore would change everything. A real estate deal that was guaranteed to double the money in 6 months. The pieces started falling into place in my mind, each one worse than the last. "A project," I said slowly. "What kind of project?" Mark turned his back, saying nothing. "It was a scam," Mom whispered. "A fraudulent investment scheme. The man running it disappeared with all the money. $200,000. Gone overnight." I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. "You knew?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mom hesitated. I found out after he signed the papers. I begged him to pull out, but it was too late. And what I demanded." Her next words made my blood run cold. "I mortgaged the house to give him more. I thought if we added more money we could recover it. I thought it would buy us more time." I stared at her in disbelief. You mortgaged the house." She nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "I did it to protect him. I wanted to believe in him. I thought he was trying to save us." I turned to Mark, my anger boiling. "You let her risk everything? You made her sign away the house for a scam." He didn't answer. He just stared at the ground. But that wasn't the end. Mrs. Allen, who had been standing nearby, stepped closer. "Anna, there's something else you should know," she said softly. She hesitated, glancing at Mom, who closed her eyes like she already knew what was coming. "What is it?" I asked, my voice already breaking. Mrs. Allen spoke gently, like she was trying to soften the blow. "I've seen Mark, with another woman, at a cafe downtown. They've been together for months." The world tilted. I looked at Mark, my heart pounding. "Is that true?" I asked, my voice rising. "Is it true?" He finally looked at me, and in his silence, I had my answer. Mom sobbed quietly. I knew, she whispered. I turned to her in shock. "You knew?" She nodded slowly, her face crumpling. "I knew, but I thought, if I just stayed, if I just supported him, he would stay with me. I thought if I proved I believed in him, he wouldn't leave me completely." My heart shattered. My mother had sacrificed everything, our home, her dignity, even her relationship with me, to protect a man who not only ruined her financially, but betrayed her love. "So you knew he was cheating?" I said, my voice shaking with disbelief, "and you still mortgaged the house for him? You still took the blame, even when he destroyed everything?" She looked at me with hollow eyes. "I didn't want to lose him," she whispered. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even think. All the pain I'd been feeling turned into something sharper, anger mixed with pity, mixed with sorrow too heavy to hold. So it was all for nothing. The loan wasn't for a business. It wasn't for stability. It was for a con. And the man she gave up everything to protect had another woman the entire time. Mark finally muttered something, his voice low. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he said. "She said it was a sure thing. I thought I could fix everything." But his excuses meant nothing. He had destroyed her life. And in the process, she had destroyed mine. As the bank officials began moving through the house, tagging furniture, and boxing up decades of memories, I stood frozen. Mom sat back down on the porch, her face in her hands. Mark walked away, heading toward his truck, not even looking back. It was over. She lost the house. She lost the money. And she lost him. I realized in that moment, she hadn't just lost the man she chose after my father left. She had lost herself. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake her and demand why she didn't tell me the truth before it was too late. Why she let her pride, her fear, her love for a man who didn't deserve it, destroy everything. But I said nothing. I just stood there, feeling a strange mix of heartbreak and bitter clarity. The woman who had once been my rock had chosen a man over her own daughter. She had hidden the truth, pushed me away, and in the end, she had nothing left, not even him. And for the first time in my life, I didn't know if I could ever forgive her. The house was gone. The loan had defaulted, the bank had taken everything, and Mark had vanished like a shadow at sunrise. I didn't see him again after that day. He didn't even have the courage to face what he had done. It was almost a relief that he disappeared, because it spared me the rage I still felt simmering beneath the surface. But my mother, she was still there, left with nothing but the clothes on her back and the weight of her own regret. For a while she stayed with a distant cousin in town, too ashamed to call me. But one evening, I got a call. Her voice on the other end was so small, so fragile, it barely sounded like her at all. "Anna," she whispered, I don't know where else to go." I paused for a moment, staring at the phone. A part of me wanted to hang up. A part of me wanted to remind her of the slap, the rejection, the way she told me I was no longer her daughter. But another part, the part that still saw the woman who raised me, who once held me when I was sick, who made sacrifices in her own flawed way, couldn't turn her away. So I told her to come to Seattle. When she arrived, she looked like a ghost of herself. She was thinner, her clothes loose and wrinkled. She carried one small suitcase that looked like it could barely hold anything of value. Her eyes were red hollow from too many sleepless nights. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother as a person, not the invincible figure from my childhood, but a woman who had been broken by her own choices and misplaced loyalty. I gave her the small guest room in my apartment. She sat on the edge of the bed, looking around quietly as if she wasn't sure she deserved to be there. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence was thick, filled with all the words we hadn't said to each other. Finally, she broke it. "I was wrong," she said, her voice trembling. "I was so wrong, Anna. I thought I could control it. I thought if I just stayed strong, no one would see how bad it was. I was so afraid of you looking at me and seeing weakness." I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, unsure what to say. "I told myself I was protecting you," she continued, "that you didn't need to see the mess I made. But the truth is, I was protecting myself. From shame, from your disappointment, from the truth I didn't want to face." She looked up at me, then her eyes glistening. "I shouldn't have said those things to you. I shouldn't have hit you. I shouldn't have turned you away. That's the worst thing I've ever done as a mother." I stayed quiet, letting her words hang in the air. "I wanted so badly to believe Mark would save us," she whispered. "I gave him everything. I thought love meant standing by someone no matter what. Even when he hurt me. Even when I knew he was lying. I didn't realize I was destroying myself and you in the process." I finally stepped into the room. "Mom," I said softly, "I can't forget what happened. I can't forget how much it hurt when you turned me away, when you chose him over me, when you hit me." She flinched as if my words were physical blows. "But," I continued, taking a breath, "I also can't ignore that you're still my mother, and I can't watch you fall apart. Not completely." She let out a shaky breath, tears streaming down her face. "I don't deserve your help. she whispered. Maybe not, I said honestly, but I'm not helping you because you deserve it. I'm helping you because I choose to. But Mom, there have to be boundaries this time. She nodded quickly, almost desperately. Anything. I'll do anything you ask. I sat beside her on the bed. Here's what's going to happen, I said calmly. You can stay here for now. I'll help you get back on your feet, find a job, and rebuild your life. But this isn't forever, and you have to agree no more secrets, no more lies. If you ever get into trouble again, you have to come to me before it explodes. Do you understand? Yes, she whispered. And one more thing, I said. No more Mark. No more men who take everything from you and leave you with nothing. If he tries to contact you, you cut him off. If you can't, then I can't help you. I will not be pulled into his mess ever again. She nodded, her shoulders trembling. I'm done with him, she said. Completely done. I searched her face looking for any hint of doubt, but there was none. Just exhaustion and defeat. For the next few weeks, she stayed quietly in my apartment. She slept a lot at first, her body finally giving in to the exhaustion it had been carrying for months. Slowly, she began to help around the house, cooking, cleaning, small things to contribute. I found her sitting by the window some mornings, just staring out at the city. I knew she was mourning not just the house she lost, but the life she thought she had. We talked, but carefully. We didn't rehash every detail of what happened. Instead, we focused on what came next. I helped her update her resume, reached out to contacts in Seattle to find her part-time work. She eventually got a job as a receptionist at a small community center, something simple but stable. There were still moments when the old resentment flared up inside me, like when I saw the faint scar on my cheek from where she had slapped me, or when I remembered standing on that porch being told I was no longer her daughter. But there were also moments of quiet forgiveness, like when I saw her struggling to fold laundry because her hands were shaking, or when she quietly left a cup of tea on my desk while I worked late. I realized something important during those weeks. My mother wasn't just a villain in this story. She was a victim too of her own fear, her own loneliness, and her own need to believe in someone who wasn't worth it. It didn't excuse her choices, but it made me understand them. Eventually, we had one final honest conversation. I can't change the past, she said quietly one night as we sat at the kitchen table. I can't undo what I did. I know I hurt you more than anyone else ever could. I'll regret that for the rest of my life. But if you let me, I want to be better. I want to earn back even a small piece of your trust. I looked at her for a long moment before speaking. You can't earn it overnight, I said softly. It's going to take time, and I don't know how much I can give you back, but I'll give you a chance. She nodded, tears in her eyes. That was enough. So no, I couldn't save the house. I couldn't erase the betrayal. I couldn't make us the family we used to be, but I could choose not to let bitterness define the rest of our lives. I set my boundaries. I would help her rebuild, but I would never let her or anyone drag me into their downfall again. And slowly, painfully, we started over. Not as mother and child in the same way we once were, but as two women learning to trust each other again, step by fragile step. Looking back, I've realized something I never understood before. Sometimes the people you love the most push you away, not because they truly want to lose you, but because they're drowning in their own fear and shame. My mother wasn't cruel at her core. She was scared. Scared that I would see her weakness. Scared that I'd think less of her. Scared that admitting the truth would destroy the little hope she was clinging to. But love isn't about rescuing someone blindly. It's not about sacrificing yourself to fix every mistake they've made. And it's definitely not about enabling them to keep falling deeper into the hole they've dug. Real love, the kind that actually heals, sometimes requires distance. It requires painful honesty. It requires boundaries strong enough to save not just the person you're trying to help, but yourself as well. When I was standing outside that house, rejected by the woman who once swore she would never abandon me, I felt an anger and heartbreak I didn't think I could recover from. I felt like I had lost her forever. And in some ways, I did lose the version of her I had idolized, the strong, unshakable mother who could do no wrong. But what I gained much later was something more real, a fragile, imperfect human connection. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending the betrayal didn't happen. It means acknowledging the pain, setting the boundaries you need to protect yourself, and still choosing not to let hate define you. I didn't forgive my mother overnight. I didn't trust her immediately, but I gave her a chance to try again, not because she earned it in that moment, but because I decided I wouldn't let her failure turn me into someone bitter. She had to do her own work. She had to face the reality of her choices. She had to rebuild herself piece by piece without leaning on someone like Mark, without making excuses, without dragging me into another storm. And slowly, she did. But only after I stepped back and told her, I'll help you stand, but I won't let anyone use me like this ever again. It's a hard lesson. That sometimes the only way to save a relationship is to stop saving the person, to let them feel the consequences of what they've done, to let them hit their own rock bottom so they can choose to climb out themselves. And sometimes, despite all of that, things won't be what they used to be. My mother and I will never go back to the easy, warm bond we once shared. Too much happened, too much was said. But we found a new way forward. A quieter, humbler relationship built on truth instead of illusions. If there's one thing I want anyone listening to take away, it's this. You are allowed to set boundaries even with the people you love, especially with the people you love. Helping someone doesn't mean losing yourself. Love isn't endless sacrifice. Love is protecting what's healthy sometimes by saying no. So I'll ask you, have you ever been pushed away by your own family only to watch them face the consequences of their own choices? Have you ever had to draw that painful line between love and enabling? If you have, know that you're not alone. There are so many of us who have stood in that impossible place wanting to save someone but realizing you can't do it for them. And if this story resonates with you, if it reminds you of something you've lived or someone you know is living right now, please share it. You never know who might need to hear that they're not the only one going through this. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more true stories like this. Stories that remind us that even in the darkest family betrayals, there can still be healing, there can still be lessons, and there can still be a way forward.